$11. That was all she had left, and she counted it 3 times like the number might change. 9 months pregnant, abandoned that morning by the man who was supposed to be her child's father. She sat in the last booth for 2 hours, untouched water going warm, doing math on how many hours a body could survive once the cold came down off the plains. Then a stranger walked in. Broad shoulders, grey beard, a patch on his jacket she didn't understand yet. She had 1 napkin, 1 pen, and 6 words left to try, and no idea what he would do the moment he read them. The sundown diner sat where the flatness of the Texas panhandle met the edge of Amarillo, a low building of chipped yellow paint and a neon sign that buzzed more than it glowed. In late October, the wind came down off the plains hard enough to rattle the windows, carrying the smell of dust and diesel from the truck stop across the road. Inside, the diner smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, and the jukebox in the corner had not worked since summer. Christine Whitmore sat in the last booth by the window, the one with a crack in the vinyl seat patched with silver tape. She was 24 and 9 months pregnant, though in the weak light of the diner, she looked closer to someone carrying the weight of 10 hard years than a child. Her coat was too thin for the season, a denim jacket lined with fleece that had lost most of its warmth somewhere around the second wash. One hand rested on the swell of her belly, the other wrapped around a glass of water she had asked for twice and never finished. She had $11 in her pocket, a phone with a cracked screen and no service plan, and a duffel bag under the table that held everything she still owned. 2 shirts, a photograph of her mother, who had died 4 years earlier, a prenatal vitamin bottle, half empty. She had left the apartment that morning, if leaving was the right word for it. Her boyfriend, Kyle, had told her plainly without raising his voice that he was done, that the baby was not something he had signed up for, and that she should have somewhere else to be by the time he got back from his shift. She had believed for a long time that he did not mean it, until she saw her bag already packed and sitting outside the door. She had no family left in Amarillo. Her mother was gone. Her father had left before Christine could remember his face. There was an aunt in Lubbock she had not spoken to in 6 years, not since a falling out neither of them had tried to repair. She had thought about a shelter, but the 2 she knew of were full, according to a church hotline volunteer who had sounded genuinely sorry and genuinely unable to help. So she had ridden a bus as far as her last few dollars would take her, and then walked until the sundown diner appeared out of the grey afternoon like the only lit building left on earth. The waitress, an older woman named Donna, with reading glasses pushed into grey hair, had let her sit there for 2 hours without a word about the untouched menu. Donna had seen enough hard luck pass through the sundown to know the difference between someone killing time and someone with nowhere else to go. She brought Christine a second glass of water without being asked, and a paper napkin, unprompted, the way some people just knew to leave a door open a crack. It was watching the door swing open with the wind and the sound of boots on the tile that Christine looked up. The man who walked in was not the first biker she had seen that day. Amarillo sat along a stretch of highway that pulled in riders heading east and west, and leather jackets were nothing unusual in a place like the sundown. But this one moved differently. He was broad through the shoulders, grey showing at his temples under a faded bandana, and he walked like a man who had spent 30 years on a motorcycle and 30 more learning not to hurry through a room. His jacket had a patch on the left breast, worn soft with age, the kind that told you he belonged to something bigger than himself. He took a stool at the counter, nodded once to Donna, and ordered black coffee and eggs without looking at a menu the way a regular does. His name was Wayne Sutter. He was 51, and he had ridden 210 miles that day from Oklahoma City, chasing the last of the good weather before the panhandle turned mean for winter. He had been a long-haul rider most of his adult life, had done 2 tours overseas before that, and had learned somewhere in the space between those 2 lives that silence said more than most people gave it credit for. He noticed things the way a mechanic notices an engine running just slightly wrong. Small, easy to miss, impossible to unhear once caught. What he noticed halfway through his coffee was the young woman in the back booth, who had not touched her water in 10 minutes, whose hand kept moving to her belly in a way that looked less like comfort and more like bracing, and whose eyes kept finding the door and then the road beyond it, as if she was doing arithmetic with no good answer. He did not go over right away. Wayne had learned in 51 years that some kindnesses need an invitation before you offer them, or you risk turning help into an intrusion. He drank his coffee and let 10 minutes pass, watching Donna refill the young woman's water a third time and pat her shoulder in passing, and he saw the young woman's jaw tighten, like she was trying hard not to cry in front of a stranger. It was Donna who gave him his invitation. She came to refill his coffee and, low enough that only he could hear, said, "That girl's been sitting 2 hours, 9 months along if I had to guess. Hasn't ordered a thing. I don't think she's got anywhere to be tonight, Wayne. And I don't mean she's got no plans, I mean I don't think she's got anywhere." Wayne looked over his shoulder. Christine had taken the paper napkin and was folding it, unfolding it, hands needing something to do besides shake. Outside, the sky over the flatlands was going the color of a bruise, the temperature already dropping toward a night that would be cold enough to matter. He did not know her name yet, or what had put her in that booth, or what she was walking toward, if anything. All he knew was what 30 years of highways had taught him about people who looked like they were running out of nowhere to go. You did not get many chances to be the thing that stopped someone from finding out what came after nowhere. He left $3 for Donna, picked up his coffee, and walked toward the back booth. Christine heard the boots before she saw who they belonged to, and her whole body went rigid the way it had learned to do whenever a man approached her without warning. She kept her eyes down on the napkin she had been folding into smaller squares and braced for whatever was coming. A request to move along, a complaint about the booth, or worse, nothing at all. Wayne stopped at the edge of her table and did not sit down uninvited. That mattered more than he knew. "Evening," he said, his voice low and unhurried. "Mind if I sit a minute? Donna makes the best coffee in 3 counties, but she's terrible company when she's working the register." Christine looked up. Whatever she had braced for, it was not the small, crooked smile that came with the joke, or the fact that he was still standing, waiting for her actual answer instead of assuming it. She glanced past him toward the counter, where Donna was very deliberately wiping a spot that did not need wiping, watching without watching. "It's a free country," Christine said, which was not a yes, but was not a no either, and Wayne took it as the invitation it was meant to be. He set his coffee down across from her and lowered himself into the booth slowly, the way a big man learns to move in small spaces so he does not seem like a threat. For a while, neither of them said anything. Wayne did not ask her name right away, and he did not ask what was wrong, both of which surprised her. Most people who noticed her situation, and fewer noticed than she expected, either looked away fast or asked too much too soon. Wayne just sat there, turning his coffee cup a quarter turn every so often, giving her room. "Cold one coming tonight," he finally said, nodding toward the window, where the last grey light was draining out of the sky over the flat horizon. "Supposed to drop into the 20s by morning. Wind'll make it feel worse." "I heard," Christine said. She had heard it on someone's truck radio outside a gas station 2 towns back, and she had spent every hour since then doing math she did not want to do, about how many hours a person could survive outside in that kind of cold, and what she would do about the baby if the answer was not enough hours. "You waiting on somebody?" Wayne asked. It was a fair question, and an easy one to lie to, and Christine almost did. The ride is coming, everything is handled, the lie she had rehearsed all morning in case anyone asked. But something about the way he asked, not fishing, not suspicious, just leaving the door open, made the lie feel heavier than the truth. "No," she said instead, and the word came out smaller than she meant it to. "I'm not waiting on anybody." Wayne did not react the way she expected. He did not look surprised or pitying or uncomfortable. He just nodded slowly, like she had confirmed something he already suspected, and let the silence sit there without rushing to fill it with questions. It was Christine who broke it in the end, because the silence itself had become unbearable, full of everything she had been carrying alone for the last 6 hours. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said so quietly that at first Wayne thought he might have misheard her over the hum of the diner's old refrigerator case. "I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like something you'd tell a stranger to get money out of him. I'm not asking you for money. I didn't think you were," Wayne said, and he meant it. 30 years on the road had taught him the difference between a hustle and a person telling the truth, because they had run out of the energy to do anything else. Christine looked down at the napkin she had folded and unfolded without noticing. On an impulse she did not fully understand, she reached for the pen clipped to the check holder and pressed it to the paper. Her hand was shaking slightly, whether from cold or fear or 6 hours of holding herself together, and the letters came out uneven, but clear enough. "I have nowhere to go." She slid the napkin across the table because saying the words out loud again felt like more than she could manage, and because some part of her needed the sentence to exist outside her own mouth, written down, undeniable. Wayne looked at the napkin for a long moment before picking it up. He read it once, and then again, eyes moving slowly over the 6 words, like he was making sure he understood every one of them. Then he set his coffee cup down, and he stood up from the booth. Christine's stomach dropped. This was the part, she thought, where he apologized and left, the way everyone eventually left: Kyle, her aunt in Lubbock, the world in general. She braced for it, folding her hands tightly over the napkin, as if she could take the words back, now that he had seen them. But Wayne did not walk toward the door. He walked toward the counter, where Donna was watching with an expression that said she already knew more than she was letting on, and he said something too quiet for Christine to hear. Donna's face changed. Not surprise, Christine would realize later, but recognition, like she had been waiting all evening for exactly this. Wayne came back to the booth, but he did not sit back down. He stood beside it, one hand resting on the back of the seat across from her, and he looked at Christine the way very few people had looked at her in a long time. Not as a problem to be managed, and not as an inconvenience to be avoided, but as a person. "Nobody's leaving you out in that cold tonight," he said. "Not while I'm standing here." Christine did not know in that moment whether to believe him. She had believed people before, and believing them had cost her almost everything she had left, but there was something in the way he said it. Not a promise made lightly, the kind people made to feel generous for 5 minutes before they disappeared, but something steadier, something that sounded like a man stating a fact rather than making an offer. "You don't even know my name," she said, and it came out half like a warning and half like a question. "Don't need to know it yet," Wayne said. "Figured we'd start with getting you someplace warm, and the name could come after." He paused, and something in his face softened further. Some old memory crossing behind his eyes that Christine could not read yet, but would come to understand later. "But if you want to tell me anyway, I'm listening." "Christine," she said. "Christine Whitmore." "Wayne Sutter," he said, and held out a hand that was rough and scarred across the knuckles, the hand of a man who had spent a lifetime working with his own 2 fists instead of asking someone else to. Christine hesitated only a second before she took it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the diner's old windows in their frames, and the first hard edge of the cold front rolled in off the plains like it had heard everything that had just been decided and meant to test it. Wayne did not have a solution for everything, and he was honest with Christine about that from the start, sitting back down across from her while Donna brought over a plate of eggs and toast that Christine had not ordered and would not be allowed to pay for. What he did have was a phone with a contact list that read like a map of every state between Texas and the Canadian border. Riders he had bunked with, fed, and been fed by over 3 decades of highway life. Men and women who understood the particular language of showing up for a stranger, because someone had once shown up for you. The first call he made was to a man named Russell, who ran a modest motel off the interstate a mile from the diner. The kind of place with a flickering vacancy sign and rooms that smelled like old carpet cleaner, but had working heat and locking doors, which was more than Christine had access to an hour earlier. Russell owed Wayne a favor from years back, something about a blown tire on a January night that Wayne had waved off without ever asking to be repaid. And when Wayne asked for one room, paid up front, no questions, Russell did not hesitate. "Room 12's open," Russell said. "Heat works good in that one. I'll leave it unlocked till you get there." Christine sat through all of this with the strange, hollowed-out feeling of watching a decision get made about her life by someone who was, 3 hours earlier, a complete stranger. Part of her wanted to refuse it out of pride, the same pride that had kept her from calling her aunt in Lubbock even when she had nowhere else to turn. But pride was a luxury she could not afford anymore, not with the temperature dropping and a baby that would arrive whether or not she had a plan for where. "I can't pay you back for this," she said quietly, once Wayne had hung up the phone. "Didn't ask you to," Wayne said. "This isn't a loan, Christine. I'm not keeping a tab." "Why?" The question came out sharper than she meant it, edged with the exhaustion of a person who had learned the hard way that kindness without a price tag usually turned out to have one hidden somewhere. "Why would you do this for somebody you don't even know?" Wayne was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup the way he had before, and when he answered, his voice had a different weight to it, older and rougher around the edges. "Had a sister once," he said. "Younger than me by 6 years. Got herself into a bad situation when she was about your age. Bad man, no money, baby on the way, family too proud or too tired to help. I was overseas when it happened. Didn't find out how bad it got until I came home." He paused. "By then, it was too late to be the one who showed up. I've spent a fair amount of years since then trying to be the person somebody needed when I can be. Doesn't fix what happened to her. Doesn't come close. But it's something." Christine did not ask what had happened to his sister. Something in the set of his jaw told her the ending was not a good one, and some kindnesses were in not making a man say a thing twice. She understood in that moment that Wayne was not saving her out of some abstract sense of duty. He was doing it because there was a version of this exact night, years ago, where somebody like him had not shown up in time, and he had been carrying the weight of that absence ever since. Wayne drove her to the motel himself, in his truck rather than on the bike, because the wind chill had dropped hard enough by then that riding was not sensible for either of them. And Christine, 9 months pregnant, had no business on the back of a motorcycle, regardless of the weather. The truck was as old and well kept as everything else about him, a Ford with 200,000 miles on it, and a dashboard covered in a fine film of highway dust. Christine sat with her duffel bag in her lap, watching the diner shrink in the side mirror, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself cry. Not from fear this time, but from something closer to relief, the kind that comes when a body finally stops bracing for a blow that has not landed. Room 12 was small and plain, but it was warm, and the bed had clean sheets, and the lock on the door worked. Wayne carried her bag in and set it by the bed without making a show of it. He left a folded 20 on the nightstand, for breakfast, he said, and pizza if she wanted it delivered, and he told her Russell's number was on the pad by the phone if the heat gave her any trouble in the night. "I'll come by in the morning," Wayne said, standing in the doorway with the cold pressing in behind him. Figure out what comes next then. Tonight, you just need to sleep somewhere warm." "You don't have to," Christine said, though there was no real protest left in it. "I know," Wayne said. "Get some rest, Christine." He left, and she heard his truck pull out of the lot, and for a long time after that, she sat on the edge of the bed, with her hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift and settle the way it did most nights, and she let herself think, for the first time in weeks, that maybe morning would not be as frightening as every morning before it had been. But Wayne, driving back toward the highway rather than toward his own bed at a motel further down the strip, was not finished for the night. He had learned long ago that a single act of kindness, however sincere, was rarely enough to fix a problem the size of the one Christine was carrying. No home, no income, a baby due any day, and a support system that had failed her at every turn. He pulled his phone back out at a red light and began scrolling through a much longer list of contacts than the one that had produced Russell's motel room. Riders, old friends, people who owed him favors and people he owed favors to in return. A network built over 30 years of showing up, the kind of network that did not exist on paper anywhere, but was in its own way as real and as strong as any family. He typed the same message to a dozen different people before he reached the edge of town. "Got a situation. Pregnant girl, no family, no place to land. Need help figuring out next steps. Housing, maybe work, maybe just people checking in on her. Anybody local to Amarillo, or anybody who's dealt with something like this before, call me." By the time he reached the motel where he was staying the night, 3 people had already called back. By morning, what had started as a single phone call had become something Wayne had not fully anticipated and had certainly not planned. He arrived at room 12 just after 8 with 2 coffees and a bag of breakfast tacos from a stand near the motel, expecting to talk through practical next steps with Christine, a shelter placement maybe, or a longer-term motel arrangement while they figured out something more stable. What he had instead was 17 missed calls and a phone that had not stopped buzzing since 5 in the morning. The message he had sent the night before had not stayed contained to a dozen contacts. Riders talked to other riders. A woman named Rachel, who ran a small charity out of Lubbock, connecting displaced mothers with temporary housing, had gotten the message forwarded from a friend of Wayne's and had called him before sunrise, offering not just advice, but an actual apartment, a small furnished unit her organization kept for exactly this kind of emergency, available that same day, 6 weeks free, while Christine got on her feet, with resources afterward to help her find work and permanent housing. A man named Todd, who ran a garage in Amarillo and had ridden with Wayne for over a decade, had heard about the situation from someone in the group and offered Christine a job at the front desk the moment she was ready, flexible hours, no experience required, health coverage after 90 days that would matter enormously once the baby came. But it was the third call, the one from a woman named Melissa, that changed the scale of everything. Melissa ran the regional chapter of a riders' association Wayne had belonged to for over 20 years, a loose network of motorcycle clubs across the Panhandle and beyond that showed up, historically, for 2 kinds of events: charity rides for sick children and funerals for members who had died on the road. Melissa had heard the story secondhand from someone who had heard it from someone else, the way stories moved fast inside a community that talked to each other more than most families did, and by the time she called Wayne at 7 in the morning, she had already started making calls of her own. "You know what this is, don't you?" Melissa said, when Wayne finally got a word in. "This is a girl 9 months pregnant who got left with nothing by everybody who was supposed to show up for her. And you didn't walk past her. That's not a small thing, Wayne. People need to hear that somebody didn't walk past her." What Melissa was proposing was not subtle. She wanted to organize a ride. Not a small gesture, not a handful of friends dropping off donations, but an actual organized run, riders converging from 3 counties to escort Christine, publicly and deliberately, into the next chapter of her life. A show of force, in its own way, against the idea that a pregnant woman with nowhere to go could simply be forgotten by the world around her. Melissa believed, and said so plainly, that if 500 riders showed up for one scared young woman, it would say something true and necessary, not just to Christine, but to every diner and gas station and church parking lot full of people who might otherwise decide it was not their problem to solve. Wayne was hesitant at first, in a way that surprised even him. He had spent 30 years being the quiet one, the man who did the work and let it speak for itself, and the idea of turning Christine's worst night into a public spectacle sat uneasily with him. He said as much to Melissa and to Christine when he brought it to her later that morning over the breakfast tacos, half expecting her to refuse outright. Christine did not refuse. She sat with it for a long moment, turning the idea over, the way she had turned the napkin over in her hands the night before, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier than it had been in weeks. "I spent the last 6 months feeling like I didn't matter to anybody," she said, "like I was something people were trying to figure out how to get rid of. If a bunch of strangers on motorcycles want to show up and say I do matter, I'm not going to tell them not to." She paused, one hand resting on her belly. "Besides, my kid's going to ask someday how we got through this. I'd rather tell them the truth got loud, instead of telling them we just got quietly lucky." The ride was organized over the following 4 days. Word moving through the riders' network the way it always did, fast and informal and impossible to fully track. A message forwarded here, a phone call there, a post on a private forum that 3 different clubs read religiously. Melissa's initial guess of a modest turnout, maybe 50 or 60 riders from the immediate area, proved wildly conservative. Word reached clubs in Lubbock and Oklahoma City, then further to Wichita Falls, and even a chapter as far as Albuquerque. Riders who had never met Christine and never would meet Wayne in person, deciding, on the strength of a story passed hand to hand, that this was worth 4 hours on a motorcycle in November. On the morning of the ride, Christine stood outside the small apartment Rachel's organization had arranged for her, the first place in over a year that was entirely, unambiguously hers, and watched the horizon fill with motorcycles the way a storm front fills a sky, first a distant hum, then a visible line, then an unbroken column of riders stretching back farther than she could see, engines loud enough to rattle the windows of every building on the block. Wayne stood beside her, having refused to lead the procession himself, insisting the day belonged to Christine and not to him, though every rider who passed nodded to him first, out of a respect that did not need to be spoken aloud. Christine had expected, if she had let herself expect anything at all, that this would feel overwhelming in a bad way. Too much attention, too much noise, too much proof of exactly how alone she had been before this week. Instead, standing on the sidewalk with her hand resting on her belly, watching 500 strangers ride slowly past in a gesture that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with choice, she felt something she had not expected to feel again for a very long time. She felt seen. Somewhere in that long column of engines, riders she would never learn the names of were carrying a version of her story that had already changed shape in the retelling, the way stories do when they travel faster than the people in them. The details had blurred, but the part that mattered had stayed intact through every version. A woman had been left with nothing, and a stranger had refused to let that be the end of it. That was the part people repeated to each other at gas stations along the route, the part that had pulled riders out of their garages on a cold Tuesday morning for a woman most of them would never speak a single word to. Christine understood, standing there with the noise of 500 engines rolling past like distant thunder, that she was not the only person that column represented. Somewhere in the crowd were other Waynes, other Donnas, other Melissas and Todds and Rachels, ordinary people who had simply decided at some point that showing up mattered more than staying comfortable. She was not being rescued by strangers so much as welcomed into something that had existed long before she walked into the sundown diner, and would go on existing long after she was steady enough to stand on her own. Christine Whitmore's daughter was born 11 days later in the second week of November, in a hospital room in Amarillo, with Rachel from the housing charity holding one hand and Donna from the sundown diner, who had driven 40 minutes through a rainstorm to be there, holding the other. Wayne was in the waiting room the entire night, along with 4 other riders who had appointed themselves, without being asked, as a kind of informal family for a woman who had spent most of the last year believing she did not have one. He did not go in for the birth itself. That, he said, was not his place. But he was the first person Christine asked for once the baby was cleaned and wrapped and quiet, and when he came into the room and looked down at the small, red-faced infant in her arms, something in his face did something Christine had not seen it do before. Not quite tears, but close enough to them that Donna, watching from the doorway, pretended very hard to be checking her phone. Christine named her daughter Donna Ray, after the waitress who had left a second glass of water without being asked, and it was the kind of detail Donna would tell for the rest of her life to anyone who sat in booth 4 at the sundown diner and asked about the framed photograph behind the register. Christine, exhausted and glowing, holding a newborn, surrounded by a small crowd of people who had been strangers to her 2 weeks earlier, and were not strangers anymore. The apartment Rachel's organization had arranged became permanent within 2 months, extended through a program the charity ran for new mothers rebuilding on their own, and Todd's offer of work at the garage became a real job with real hours once Christine was ready, the front desk of a business that turned out to be full of exactly the kind of people who checked in on a co-worker's baby without being asked to. It was not, in the end, an easy road. There were nights that first winter when the baby would not sleep and the bills stacked up faster than the paychecks did, when Christine sat alone in the apartment at 3 in the morning and let herself remember briefly what it had felt like sitting in that diner booth with $11 and no plan. But those nights were different now, because they ended with a phone call to someone who picked up, and because being alone at 3 in the morning was no longer the same thing as being without anyone at all. Wayne visited every few weeks, whenever a ride took him through the Panhandle, and he became, without either of them ever formally deciding it, something like family. Not a father to Donna Ray, and not quite an uncle either, but a fixed point in the girl's life that both Christine and Wayne understood mattered more than a title would have. He taught Christine how to change a tire the winter Donna Ray turned one, standing in the apartment parking lot with grease on his hands, telling her that a woman on her own should never have to wait on a stranger for something she could learn to do herself. It was, in its own quiet way, a kind of promise. Not that he would always be there to rescue her, but that he trusted her enough to make sure she never needed rescuing the same way twice. Melissa and the Riders Association did not disappear once the excitement faded either. What had started as a single organized ride became, within the year, a standing fund the association kept for exactly this kind of emergency. A small pool of money and a phone tree of volunteers ready to move fast for anyone in the Panhandle who found themselves the way Christine had, out of options and out of time. They named it without much debate the Napkin Fund, and by the following autumn it had already helped 3 other families Wayne would never meet but would hear about second-hand. Wayne found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he had become something like an elder statesman among the riders who ran it, a man people called not because he had special expertise, but because he had been the one who started it, however unintentionally, by simply not walking past a booth by the window. Donna kept the sundown diner running much the same as it always had, though she added, without asking anyone's permission, a small handwritten sign near the register that read, "You don't have to explain why you're here." She never told most customers what it meant, but the regulars who had been there long enough understood, and more than one stranger passing through Amarillo over the following years found themselves sitting in a booth a little too long, nursing a cup of coffee they could not really afford, and being quietly, deliberately left alone by a waitress who had learned exactly how much kindness a person could stand to receive before it became too much to bear. The story of the napkin traveled further than any of them expected. A local news station picked it up first, a short segment about the ride that had brought 500 motorcycles into Amarillo for a stranger, and from there it moved the way stories do now, past the boundaries of any one town or state, told and retold by people who had never met Christine or Wayne and never would. Most of the details blurred in the retelling, the way details always do, but the heart of it stayed constant, no matter how many times it was passed along. A scared young woman had written 6 words on a napkin because she had run out of any other way to ask for help, and a stranger had read them and had refused to let that be where her story ended. Christine kept the napkin. It sat, eventually, in a small frame on the wall of the apartment, beside a photograph of Donna Ray's first birthday, surrounded by a small crowd of riders who had shown up again a year later, not because anyone had organized it this time, but because they wanted to. The ink had faded slightly, and one corner of the paper had softened from handling, but the 6 words were still legible, still exactly as she had written them on the worst night of her life. I have nowhere to go. It was no longer true, and had not been true for a long time, but Christine kept the napkin anyway, because it reminded her of something she thought every person deserved to understand, sooner rather than later, about the world they lived in. That even on the coldest night, in the loneliest booth at the very end of what a person could carry alone, it was possible for a stranger to read 6 words and simply decide, without needing a reason beyond decency itself, to stand up. Wayne Sutter never thought of himself as someone who had done anything extraordinary. When people asked him about it, at diners and gas stations for years afterward, he always gave some version of the same answer, delivered without drama, the way he said most things. He had seen a woman with nowhere to go, and he had a truck and a phone full of people who cared about the same things he did, and none of that seemed to him like anything more than what anybody should have done in his position. But Christine knew better, and so did the 500 riders who had shown up that cold November morning, and so did Donna Ray, who grew up hearing the story of the napkin so many times that she could recite it herself before she was old enough to fully understand it. That somewhere in Amarillo, Texas, on an ordinary Tuesday that had felt like the end of everything, a man had read 6 words written by a stranger and had stood up and had never once sat back down.